difficult to buy them. The counter-argument made by the Second Amendment supporters correctly explained that this would only undermine the freedom of law-abiding citizens and do nothing to keep guns out of the hands of the criminals or to reduce crime. Now we hear a similar argument that a certain amount of privacy and personal liberty of law-abiding citizens must be sacrificed in order to root out possible terrorists. This will result only in liberties being lost and will not serve to preempt any terrorist attack. The criminals, just as they know how to get guns even when they are illegal, will still be able to circumvent anti-terrorist laws. To believe otherwise is to endorse a Faustian bargain, but that is what I believe the Congress has done. We know from the ongoing drug war that federal drug police not infrequently makes mistakes, breaks down the wrong doors and destroys property. Abuses of seizure and forfeiture laws are numerous, yet the new laws will encourage even more mistakes by federal law enforcement agencies. It has long been forgotten that law enforcement in the United States was supposed to be a state and local government responsibility, not that of the federal government. The federal government's policing powers have just gotten a giant boost in scope and authority through both new legislation and executive orders. Before the 9/11 attack, Attorney General Ashcroft let his position be known regarding privacy and government secrecy. Executive Order 13223 made it much more difficult for researchers to gain access to presidential documents from previous administrations, and a need to know had to be demonstrated. This was a direct hit at efforts to demand openness in government, even if only for analysis and writing of history. Ashcroft's position is that presidential records ought to remain secret even after an administration has left office. He argues that government deserves privacy while ignoring the Fourth Amendment protections of the people's privacy. He argues his case by absurdly claiming that he must protect the privacy of the individuals who might be involved, a non-problem that could easily be resolved without closing public records to the public. It is estimated that approximately 1,200 men have been arrested as a consequence of the 9/11 attacks, yet their names and charges are not available and, according to Ashcroft, will not be made available. Once again, he uses the argument that he's protecting their privacy. Unbelievable. Due process for the detainees has been denied. Secret government is winning out over open government. This is the largest number of people to be locked up under these conditions since FDR's internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. Information regarding these arrests is a must in a constitutional republic. If they're terrorists or accomplices, just let the public know and pursue their prosecution. But secret arrests and silence are not acceptable in a society that professes to be free. Curtailing freedom is not the answer to protecting freedom under adverse circumstances. The administration has severely curtailed briefings regarding the military operation in Afghanistan for congressional leaders, ignoring a long-time tradition in this country. One person or one branch of government should never control military operations. Our system of government has always required a shared power arrangement. The anti-terrorism bill did little to restrain the growth of big government. In the name of patriotism, the Congress did some very unpatriotic things. Instead of concentrating on the persons or groups that committed the attacks on 9/11, our efforts, unfortunately, have undermined the liberties of all Americans. Know your customer type banking regulations, resisted by most Americans for years, have now been put in place in an expanded fashion. Not only will the regulations affect banks, thrifts, and credit unions, but all businesses will be required to file suspicious transaction reports if cash is used with the total of the transaction reaching $10,000. Retail stores will be required to spy on all their customers and send reports to the U.S. government. Financial service consultants are convinced that this new regulation will affect literally millions of law-abiding American citizens. The odds that this additional paperwork will catch a terrorist are remote. The sad part is that these regulations have been sought after by federal law enforcement agencies for years. The 9/11 attacks have served as an opportunity to get them by the Congress and the American people. Only now are the American people hearing about the onerous portions of the anti-terrorism legislation, and they are not pleased. It's easy for elected officials in Washington to tell the American people that the government will do whatever it takes to defeat terrorism. Such assurances inevitably are followed by proposals either to restrict the constitutional liberties of the American people or to spend vast sums of money from the federal treasury. The history of the 20th century shows that the Congress violates our Constitution most often during times of crises. Accordingly, most of our worst unconstitutional agencies and programs began during the World Wars and the Depression. Ironically, the Constitution itself was conceived in a time of great crisis. The founders intended its provision to place severe restriction on the federal government, even in times of great distress. America must guard against current calls for the government to sacrifice the Constitution in the name of law enforcement. The anti-terrorism legislation recently passed by Congress demonstrates how well-meaning politicians make short-sighted mistakes in a rush to respond to a crisis. Most of its provisions were never carefully studied by Congress, nor was a sufficient time taken to debate the bill despite its importance. No testimony was heard from privacy experts or from other fields outside of law enforcement. Normal congressional committee and hearing processes were suspended. In fact, the final version of the bill was not even made available to members before the vote. The American public should not tolerate these political games, especially when our precious freedoms are at stake. Almost all of the new laws focus on American citizens rather than potential foreign terrorists. For example, the definition of terrorism for federal criminal purposes has been greatly expanded. A person could now be considered a terrorist by belonging to a pro-Constitution group, a citizens militia, or a pro-life organization. Legitimate protests against the government could place tens of thousands of other Americans under federal surveillance. Similarly, Internet use can be monitored without a user's knowledge, and Internet providers can be forced to hand over user information to law enforcement officials without a warrant or subpoena. The bill also greatly expands the use of traditional surveillance tools, including wiretaps, search warrants, and subpoenas. Probable cause standards for these tools are relaxed or even eliminated in some circumstances. Warrants become easier to obtain and can be executed without notification. Wiretaps can be placed without a court order. In fact, the FBI and the CIA now can tap telephones or computers nationwide without demonstrating that a criminal suspect is using a particular phone or computer. The biggest problem with these new law enforcement powers is that they bear little relationship to fighting terrorism. Surveillance powers are greatly expanded while checks and balances on governments are greatly reduced. Most of the provisions have been sought by domestic law enforcement agencies for years, not to fight terrorism, but rather to increase their police powers over the American people. There is no evidence that our previously held civil liberties posed a barrier to the effective tracking or prosecution of terrorists. The federal government has made no showing that it failed to detect or prevent the recent terrorist strike because of the civil liberties that will be compromised by this new legislation. In his speech to the joint session of Congress following September 11th's attack, President Bush reminded all of us that the United States outlasted and defeated Soviet totalitarianism in the last century. The numerous internal problems in the former Soviet Union, its centralized economic planning and lack of free markets, its repression of human liberty, and its excessive militarization all led to its inevitable collapse. We must be vigilant to resist the rush toward ever-increasing state control of our society so that our own government does not become a greater threat to our freedoms than any foreign terrorist. The executive order that has gotten the most attention by those who are concerned that our response to 9/11 is overreaching and dangerous to our liberties is the one authorizing military justice in secret. Nazi war criminals were tried in public, but plans now are being laid out, carry out the trials and punishment, including possibly the death penalty, outside the eyes and ears of the legislative and judicial branches of government and the American public. Since such a process threatens national security and the Constitution, it cannot be used as a justification for their protection. Some have claimed this military tribunal has been in the planning stages for 5 years. If so, what would have been its justification? The argument that FDR did it, and therefore it must be okay, is a rather weak argument. Roosevelt was hardly one that went by the rule book, the Constitution. But the situation then was quite different from today. There was a declared war by Congress against a precise enemy, the Germans, who sent 8 saboteurs into our country. Convictions were unanimous, not by 2/3 of the panel, and appeals were permitted. That's not what's being offered today. Besides, the previous military tribunal expired when the war was over. Since this war will go on indefinitely, so too will these courts. The real outrage is that such a usurpation of power can be accomplished with the stroke of a pen. It may be that we have come to that stage in our history when an executive order is the law of the land, but it's not kind of cool, as one member of the previous administration bragged. It's a process that is unacceptable even in this professed time of crisis. There are well-documented histories of secret military tribunals. Up until now, the United States has consistently condemned them. The fact that a 2/3 majority can sentence a person to death in secrecy in the United States is scary. With no appeals available and no defense attorneys of choice being permitted, should compel us to reject such a system outright. Those who favor these trials claim that they are necessary to halt terrorism in its tracks. We are told that only terrorists will be brought before these tribunals. This means that the so-called suspects must be tried and convicted before they are assigned to this type of trial without due process. They will be deemed guilty by hearsay, in contrast to the traditional American system of justice, where all are innocent until proven guilty. This turns the justice system on its head. One cannot be reassured by believing these courts will only apply to foreigners who are terrorists. Sloppiness in convicting criminals is a slippery slope. We should not forget that the Davidians at Waco were convicted and demonized and slaughtered outside our judicial system, and they were, for the most part, American citizens. Randy Weaver's family fared no better. It has been said that the best way for us to spread our message of freedom, justice, and prosperity throughout the world is through example and persuasion, not through force of arms. We have drifted a long way from that concept. Military courts will be another bad example for the world. We were outraged in 1996 when Lori Berenson, an American citizen, was tried, convicted, and sentenced to life by a Peruvian military court. Instead of setting an example, now we are following the lead of a Peruvian dictator. The ongoing debate regarding the use of torture in rounding up the criminals involved in the 9/11 attacks is too casual. This can only represent progress in the cause of liberty and justice. Once government becomes more secretive, it is more likely this tool will be abused. Hopefully, the Congress will not endorse or turn a blind eye to this barbaric proposal. For every proposal made to circumvent the judicial system, it's intended that we visualize that these infractions of the law and the Constitution will apply only to the terrorists and never involve innocent U.S. citizens. This is impossible because someone has to determine exactly who to bring before the tribunal, and that involves all of us. That is too much arbitrary power for anyone to be given in a representative government, and is more characteristic of a totalitarian government. Many throughout the world, especially those in the Muslim countries, will be convinced by the secretive process that the real reason for military courts is that the U.S. lacks sufficient evidence to convict in an open court. Should we be fighting so strenuously the war against terrorism and carelessly sacrifice our traditions of American justice? If we do, the war will be for naught and we will lose.